Hello, everyone. Welcome to this inaugural edition of Light of the World Tuesday. I am Arul Velusamy, and I'm glad to be hosting this particular inaugural edition. Now, a little bit of housekeeping before we enter into some serious content. We should be currently live on two separate channels. The first one is perhaps the one you're most familiar with, and most likely you're watching this right now there, which is Operation Stephen. But we also have a dedicated journalism channel, which goes by the name LOTW. That's the acronym for Light of the World, LOTW Press. So if you're on YouTube, may I please encourage you to tune into that channel and subscribe to that channel also to make sure you're staying on top of future episodes. So that's a little bit of housekeeping. Thank you very much for being patient with that. Now, what is this channel, or what is this journalism about? Jesus Christ said, "I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life." And so, as Christians, we believe that essentially, when we view events of this world through the lenses that Jesus Christ has taught us to view events with, we actually see an illuminated world, a world where we see problems clearly, a world where we see truth clearly as opposed to lies. So you can contrast things really clearly. And so it's very important for Christians to be able to actually take note of such things with the clarity that Jesus Christ provides. Now, of course, anyone who is familiar with the Bible might be familiar with the idea that any believer of the Bible is supposed to do many things, such as defend the defenseless, feed the poor, the orphans, help those who are in need, love your neighbor, and all these sorts of stuff we are supposed to be doing. We are also supposed to be actually calling out wickedness when it happens in the world, regardless of where the wickedness is advocated from. And to do all of these things effectively, we need to be paying attention to the world. So, as Christians, we have, in terms of our interaction with the world, at least two separate, let's say, objectives. One is to clearly present the truth of what we see in the Bible, in the gospel of Jesus Christ, to the world, which we do in terms of preaching the gospel. And likewise, we also have a parallel objective, which is speak into the life of our nation and speak into the lives of our nations. And particularly, I'm talking about the Judeo-Christian West. Christians ought to be clearly leading the nation. And if you carefully note what has been happening in the last few decades in my nation, in our nation, which is the UK, or perhaps if you're from the US or elsewhere, which is one of the Judeo-Christian West, what you would figure out is that there are many things which are happening which are contrary to the biblical worldview. And unfortunately, certainly in the UK, but maybe less so in the US, but more so in other what are meant to be Christian nations, Christian voice hasn't been heard properly. And this has been a serious problem. This, I believe, has caused various, problems that we see even today, including perhaps even the Hamas marches, which are happening in our streets. And so I think the first people to be blamed for the sort of the breaking down of societies in this manner is essentially the Christians ourselves. We need to take our responsibility seriously if we want to then expect our nation to follow in the footsteps of Jesus Christ. And so that is the background with which this light of the world journalism is going to happen through God's grace. So, God willing, we're going to provide Christian commentary on various issues, local in our own Judeo-Christian West, but also global, things that are happening across the world. and essentially giving a sort of a Christian direction in relation to how, as nations, we have to be stepping in and helping out, or stepping in and preventing misdemeanor from happening. And I'm really looking forward to the great and mighty things that God could do through Christians in this world. Now, just to give you a brief overview of the kinds of programs that we have, generally, not just today, but generally, I'll come to today's programming in a while. Maybe that can stay on the screen right now. But generally, to give you an idea, essentially, if you look at the world today and our nations today, and most of our Christian nations are multicultural, whether good or bad, of course, clearly we have issues to deal with, but we are already multicultural in many, many different ways. And therefore, various ideologies are competing against even the Christian ideology. And here is where we are going to, go through issues to help understand where our foundations are being shaken, where there are Trojan horses, where we as a nation are at crossroad, and what we need to be doing if we need to be a nation under God. And finally, in relation to understanding various issues about which we have contention in relation to even what truth is, for us to get to the bottom of the truth in understanding the truth of the matter. So that's broadly the kinds of programs that we would be covering in our Tuesdays in Light of the World. But today in particular, let me walk you through interesting segments we're going to have. Like you see on the screen right now, the first is going to be a very wonderful, hopefully, conversation that I'd be having with a very good friend of mine from Speaker's Corner, who is a Jewish thought leader, on this topic of Nakba, more on, when we actually get to the segment. Nakba, the fake news that misguides the world in truth of the matter. Subsequent to which we'll be going through, unpacking why in our nations we have serious division these days. What is really going on in our program when foundations are shaken? Subsequent to which, hopefully, I'll be again joined by a very good friend of mine to have a two-way conversation in relation to understanding the role of the church in the society, especially in the UK, but broadly in the Judeo-Christian West, in the segment Nation Under God. And finally, hopefully we'll have a brief segment on exposing one of the serious problems that Islam has, among various other problems, where Islam being a Trojan horse in our nations, where the women in Islam, are they really conservative or are they being repressed? So these are the exciting segments that I look forward to present to you today. But first, truth of the matter with my very dear friend. Now, it's an open secret that even in the Judeo-Christian West, there has been ongoing tensions in relation to the precious nation of Israel. For anyone who is a Christian, we should be aware of the fact that Israel must be beloved to us, as the Bible clearly says, God's firstborn son, as a nation, and therefore a nation that we ought to be working to support, even if there was no other problem in the world. But interestingly and unfortunately, we are also aware of the fact that, going back to the times of the Second World War and a few centuries before that, Jews have been persecuted across the world. Jews have been one of the most oppressed, well documented, most oppressed people group across the world. And so that's another important reason, from the sense of defending the defenseless, that we have to be wary of the idea of what is happening in Israel. Now, unfortunately, though, the problems that Israel has been going through in the Middle East clearly isn't confined to the Middle East alone. And we see week in, week out, how anti-Semitic marches, which are quite antagonistic to Israel, quite with even physical intimidation, that are happening in our own streets, in what are meant to be Christian nations. Why is this really happening? And when we try and unpack this, we find out that actually truth is where, even within our nation, there seems to be a disagreement on. In relation to Israel and the residents of Gaza today and the West Bank, who are popularly called Palestinians, but more accurately referred to as the Arabs in Gaza and the West Bank, between Israel and these Arabs, what is really going on? Who is the oppressed and who is the oppressor? And to get to the bottom of this is very, very important, because both sides and the supporters of both sides are claiming their side is the oppressed one and the other side is the oppressor. But unfortunately, in the media today, in what is the mainstream media, you get the louder voice, which you clearly hear, but perhaps the not so louder voice you don't hear much of, which is in support of Israel. And so that is what I really want to unpack today in this episode. Nakba, fake news that misguides the world. What is really the truth of the matter? Now, just to give you a brief introduction about this Nakba, essentially the entire sentiment, at least the feelings-based propaganda that is out in the mainstream media, is based on this idea that is propagated by the supporters of Gaza and West Bank, that the inhabitants of Gaza and West Bank have been oppressed by the nation of Israel. The term Nakba literally translates to catastrophe, that these people have gone through a significant catastrophe in 1948 at the formation of the nation of Israel, but also subsequently through the existence of the nation of Israel from 1948 till date, that somehow the nation of Israel have been oppressing the residents of Gaza and West Bank. That's the mainstream media's narration that you hear. And we want to unpack this today. And I have today with me a very special guest who might be familiar with many of you today. He is a friend of mine, an acquaintance from Speaker's Corner, Hyde Park, for quite a number of years. And he is a vocal advocate for helping people understand Israel's position. And so let's please welcome to this interview Joseph Cohen, the founder of Israel Advocacy Movement. Hello, Joseph. It's wonderful to see you today. Of course, haven't seen you in a few months, but great to see you right now. How are you doing?
It's a great honor to be here, Arul. Thank you.
I do apologize. I need to do a minor change here.
You haven't seen me for a while because I've been in Israel. I'm broadcasting from the holy city of Jerusalem, and it's a great honor to be on a show called The Light of the World, because the Jewish people, we are commanded to be an Or LaGoyim, a light unto the nations. So with help from Hashem, with help from God, I'll find words and be able to convey some of that light from Israel, from the holy city of Jerusalem.
Absolutely. It's wonderful to have you, Joseph, and I wanted to send warm regards to you. And of course, since the time we actually arranged for this particular interview to having the interview today, of course, Syria has fallen, And I know Israel is in a state where it's going through some serious changes in relation to risks from neighboring countries. And I really want to send my wishes to Israel as a nation, and to all advocates, everyone who's supporting from all quarters, to really be encouraged, despite all the risks, that through God's grace, like you rightly said, through Hashem's grace, we could actually have Israel survive through and also flourish. Now, I want to, of course, jump straight into this topic of today: Nakba, fake news that misguides the world. Of course, in popular media, we normally hear of the fact that the Arabs of Gaza and the West Bank have gone through a significant catastrophe in 1948, but also from the time since then. And I want to hear your thoughts. So, what is your broadly, to just set the context properly, what is your take on this? Did the Arabs go through a catastrophe in 1948, or do you see this in a very different light?
Yes, they went through a catastrophe, but it's not the catastrophe that the West thinks. So when you listen to the battle cry of the Arab leaders in the 40s and 30s, it was very much a one of genocide. We are going to march on Jerusalem. We're going to pave the roads from Damascus to Al-Quds to Jerusalem with the skulls of Jews. Haj Amin al-Husseini, the leader of the Palestinians at the time, declared, "Oh, my Muslim brothers, I declare a jihad. Slaughter the Jews, slaughter them all." And what happened was, upon the declaration of independence by Ben-Gurion, by the state of Israel, 5 Arab armies and internal militias launched a war of genocide against the Jews. And they failed. And they described that failure as a Nakba, as a catastrophe. What's since happened, as the world has forgotten what the Nakba was, and it's repackaged it and created a genocide or an ethnic cleansing that never happened. And they said this was the Nakba. The Nakba was that 750,000 Arabs were displaced from Palestine. But this was a complete fiction. There were a number of expulsions, but they were very small. The cities of Lod and Ramla, after fierce fighting, there were expulsions there. In total, Benny Morris, who's the leading historian on this subject, at least one of the leading historians, counted maybe 20,000 Arabs that were expelled, which is tiny in comparison to conflicts of that period. I mean, this is just years after World War II, when 6 million Jews were genocided. All the Germans that were living in certain areas of Poland were then transferred to Germany after the war. There were huge transfers. Pakistan, India, 1 million people transferred, huge genocides. None of this is referred to as a Nakba. Instead, the creation of the Jewish state with very, very, very small numbers of transfers of population, that is what the world now describes as a Nakba, to the extent that you now have millions of people around the world marching against a genocide or an ethnic cleansing that never occurred.
Exactly the kind of view that I wanted to really bring out to the table right now. So what you're really saying is, of course, there was a catastrophe, but essentially, it's not the catastrophe that the popular media advances. It's really the other way around. The oppressed are the real oppressors, who are claimed to be oppressed in the Western media today are the real oppressors, and vice versa. So I really want to dwell deep into this, but before that, to reiterate, so your point to highlight there is that the time was clearly the sort of the back end of the World War, and therefore clearly there were divisions of nations happening, and that is not unique to the Middle East of that time. And like you rightly said, clearly, of course, with partitions happening across the world, clearly there was a little bit of skirmish that can be attributed to that? So you gave the number of 20,000 Arabs who have suffered. So those we acknowledge, but your wider point is, other than those, the point is the oppressed are really the Jewish people, and the oppressors are the Arabs, inhabitants of today's Gaza and West Bank. So it's really astonishing how the storyline has changed so much in the the decades that has followed since then. So let me go back to the start. So of course you were talking about the fact that the Jewish people, of course, the 6 million people who have suffered through Holocaust, who were genuinely at that time, it should have been black and white, were the real oppressed coming into the land. Please give us some insight on the need for them arriving there, and also give us some insight on the legitimacy, not just the need, but the legitimacy of why the Jews could be there in Israel at that time.
So it's a great place to start. So there's a misconception, and particularly from Bible reading Christians and Jews, that the Jews were expelled from Israel. They weren't. Israel is the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people. My people have lived here on this land for thousands of years. I can't take 5 steps outside the building I'm in at the moment without encountering Jewish history. It's everywhere. Every street tells a story of my ancestors. Every rock you lift up, you find traces of my people underneath it. And what happened was, around 2,000 years ago, after basically having a state or a nation within this land in a form, either as a protectorate or as a sovereign state, for around 1,500 years, the Jewish people were expelled from Jerusalem after rebelling against Rome. They moved into the north of Israel, and they wrote some of our greatest works. The Jerusalem Talmud was written here after the expulsion. It's either called the Jerusalem Talmud or the Palestinian Talmud. Interestingly, even the name Palestine is appropriated, stolen from Jewish history. And I'll get into the whole history. I'll try and make it very condensed. But essentially, when the Jews rebelled against Rome, the Romans renamed the region Syria Palestina after the ancient enemies of the Jewish people, the Philistines. That name was kept alive by Europeans. And the Jews continued to live in this land. We never left. Just before the Islamic conquest, there were around 400,000 Jews living in the north. And what happened was different empires occupied the land. The British was the last of those empires after the Ottomans, and you had you had various Islamic caliphates occupying this territory. But Jews were always here. With the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the Jews started moving for self-determination. We started moving to re-establish our homeland here, and Jews that were living here took part, and Jews from outside who were being persecuted around the world in the Holocaust, in Islamic lands like the Farhud, they started moving to Israel and building up the state. In 1936, an Arab leader in this land famously said to the British, Palestine, there was never a country called Palestine. Palestine is a term the Zionists invented. It has always been Balad al-Sham, southern Syria, the land of Syria. And this was the common narrative. And so in 1948, when the Jews rightfully declared independence in their state, they didn't invade anyone. There was no violence. We didn't go into Lebanon. We didn't go into Syria. We didn't go into any. But what happened was 5 Arab armies launched a horrendous assault on the nation state. And what you have to realize is the people that these Arab armies launched a war against were the survivors of Muslim massacres, were the survivors of the Holocaust. We were so ill-equipped that there was one rifle for every 3 soldiers. We had 2 planes at the beginning of the war, 2 tiny planes which we bought from the Czechoslovakians because there was an arms embargo. The world would not sell weapons to the Jews. And still, by the grace of God, we humiliated the invading Arab armies. We drove them out. Now, Jordan conquered a territory we'd always called Yehuda v'Shomron, Judea and Samaria. You referred to it as the West Bank because Jordan was the East Bank. Jordan conquered the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. Egypt took Gaza. And the Jews were driven out of those territories. They were ethnically cleansed. Not one Jew remained in the ancient Jewish city of Hebron. Not one Jew remained in the holy city of Jerusalem, the old city where the Temple Mount stands. Not one Jew remained there. They were ethnically cleansed by the Jordanians. And then the Palestinians later down the line enforced that law to this day in Article 6 of their national charter. So the Jews were ethnically cleansed from the Arab territories. In contrast, 20% of the citizens of the new state of Israel, or the re-established state of Israel, were Arab. Today, 25% of Israelis are Arab. There was no ethnic cleansing. There was no Nakba. There was no genocide. In fact, the inverse is true. The genocide or the ethnic cleansing that took place was by the Arabs of the Jews who not only lived in Judea and Samaria and Gaza, but also the entire Arab world. 850,000 Jews were driven from their home following the 48 war. Yet the West, in all its perversion, the clueless, liberal, woke students who parade down the streets calling for an end to Israel, they completely get it twisted. They believe the ethnic cleansing was of Arabs, when in reality it was of Jews, which is why there is not one Palestinian Jew today, but there are millions of Israeli Arabs.
Lovely. Yeah, thank you very much. So clearly, like you said there, Joseph, so the point is there was a clear need for the Jews to be there because they were driven out of the other nations. But there is also a clear legitimacy, like you rightly said, it's every rock, every artifact cries out that it is a Jewish state. And also for highlighting the fact that, in Israel, clearly the fact that Arabs have survived and even increased in population is a clear indication that Jews don't mind the existence of Arabs anywhere in the world. But it seems like you also highlighted from the other side, the Muslims or the Arabs, or like you rightly pointed out also, the foreign entities again seem to want to wipe out Israel, including Egypt and other nations in this case. So thank you for that good summary. I want to know, so in other words, there was clearly a need and clearly a legitimacy for the Jews being there. I want to, I know you touched upon this already a little bit, but I want you to unpack this a little bit more. I want you to still focus on pre-1948 and unpack this idea. So in relation to the hatred that the Jews who were coming into the nation, the territory of Israel, the hatred they already faced. I hear of the riots, the terrorist attacks on Jews that were happening well before 1948 on multiple occasions in a premeditated manner. If you can please shed some light on that in relation to just unpacking or highlighting the anti-Semitic nature of the opponents of Jews involved.
So what you had, it was in 1882, the Ottomans took a census of the land, and there was an Arab majority without a shadow of a doubt, because the Jews had been persecuted for centuries under Ottoman and various other caliphates. And so our numbers had dwindled from 400,000 to, by 1882, there was around 30,000 according to Ottoman census, and around 270,000 Arabs. What happened was Jews began returning to our ancestral homeland. And there was a fierce and violent backlash to that. Now, for context, the Jews that were coming here were not militants, they weren't militias, these were largely farmers. They established small communities in land which they'd rightfully purchased from either absentee landlords and from various places, but they established small farming communities, and there was a violent backlash to their presence from the factions of the local Arabs that were living here at the time. One of the most notable of those early clashes were the 1921 Nabi Musa riots. So this is now early 20s. So for context, Britain were awarded the mandate over this region on the condition they establish a Jewish national home there. The first thing they did, so they were given this mandate in 1920. In 1921, they came up with a two-state solution, and they gave 78% of the land to the Arabs. So Palestine was cut into 3/4 and 1/4. And that 3/4 that was carved out of Palestine was called Jordan. They didn't call it Palestine because, as we know, Palestine was associated with the Jews. In fact, I still to this day drink a wine on Friday called Palwyn, the Palestine Wine Company. All the Palestinian companies back then were Jewish. But so with the establishment of a presence of the British here, when replacing the Ottomans, there was a violent uprising against the Jews that were living here, as the Arabs realized that the British may honor their requirement to establish a Jewish national home here. And so the violence escalated and got worse and worse. One of the most horrendous examples would be the 1929 massacre in Hebron. Hebron is where our patriarch, my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather is buried, Avraham Avinu, Abraham our father. And he's buried in Hebron. It was the first Jewish real estate deal. He purchased some land there, and to this day he's buried there. And the site is shared between Muslims and Jews, and Marat Makpela, as the Muslims call it, the Ibrahimi Mosque. And the Jews have lived there not since Abraham, but pretty much from that point. There's been a Jewish presence in Hebron until 1929, when an Arab pogrom rose up and started massacring the Jewish community, murdering babies, burning the synagogues to the ground, ripping apart and burning the holy, the Sefer, the Torah scrolls, and the Jews were forced to flee a city we'd lived in for centuries. And that pattern of violence escalated and escalated, with attack after attack launched against these Jewish farming communities, Jewish religious communities. And in response to that, the Jews had to establish a defense force, which was the prototype for today's military force, the Israeli Defense Force. It's not the Israeli attack force, it's the defense force. And that says it all. We had to defend our communities from the very beginning. And to this day, we're defending them. And the world perverts that and corrupts that and presents Israel as the aggressor, when in reality, Israel is only concerned about preserving the lives of its civilians, be they Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Druze.
Lovely. So in other words, the Jews merely want to exist. And of course, they have to exist somewhere. And because they have been chased away from all sorts of other places, they better at least try and exist in their own ancestral homeland. And so clearly the point is, like you rightly point out, the Arabs got their land, which is Jordan. The incoming Jews were not hostile. They didn't want the Arabs not to exist. They were merely wanting to farm, maybe in their own little ways or whatever. They merely want to come there and exist. And number three is, most of the land that was acquired were legally acquired. It wasn't, swindled away from someone, or, people being chased away and so on. So there are multiple reasons why the Arabs of that land could have been quite welcoming of the Jews, could have helped Jews out, could have seen their plight from the World War II. And the fact that they did not do that, they did not even just remain silent, but they actually wanted to say, hey, look, this little land that you've been allotted, even this we want for ourselves. So, Joe, let me just to hear this from you. So, do you clearly see a motivation from the other side, from the Arabic side, both the residents of Gaza and West Bank, and also the rest of the nations, Arabic nations? The clear intent from them is that the existence of Jews in that land was a problem already. Is that how you see it?
So I wouldn't include every Muslim and every Arab land, because there's been some tremendous progress with forward-thinking nations like the Emiratis. But as a general, and also what people just don't get until you actually visit this land is that there's real coexistence here. Today, I went to the bank. The bank clerk I met, that served me, was a Muslim. We showed each other pictures of our families. We laughed, we joked, we spoke in Arabic, Hebrew, and English. There can be real coexistence here. The issue is radical Islam. The issue is the Islamists. So when people in the West talk about the right of return for the Palestinians, they don't mean the same thing as the Palestinians. On October the 7th, the Arabs who are living in Gaza, the Islamists, Hamas, showed us exactly what they meant when they spoke about returning. They meant the violent genocide of the Jewish population here, which is why there isn't one Jew in Gaza, which is why there isn't one Jew in Ramallah, which is why there are no Jews in that, because the Palestinian vision, the Arab vision of a Palestinian state here is a state that is free of Jews. The Jewish vision, the Zionist vision of a Jewish state here is a Jewish state which protects its minority populations, which is why I'm able to have heartwarming conversations with Muslim Blanco. A family member broke their arm in Israel not so long ago. Every doctor and nurse that served us was Muslim. Every single, or Christian. There's a lot of Christian Arab doctors here. Because that's the other thing. People think the Arabs here are all Muslim. They're not. You've got Druze, which are kind of their own ethno-religious group. You've got Christians, you've got Muslims, you've got all manner of people that speak Arabic in this land. And actually, an interesting fact for a Christian channel, the group that performs best, the religious group that performs best in education in Israel, it's not religious Jews. We get trumped by Christians. Christians are the highest performing minority. A Christian judge sent a Jewish prime minister to jail. This is that people don't realize how diverse this country is until they visit it. And in contrast, how many Jews are in Syria? How many Jews are in Lebanon? How many Jews are in Egypt? How many Jews are in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, like the part that's controlled by the Palestinians? How many Jews are in Gaza? How many Jews are in Iraq? How many Jews are? Zero. There were almost 1 million Jews ethnically cleansed or forced to flee from the Muslim world. 850,000 of those from the Arab world. There are now more Jews in Boreham Wood Synagogue than the entire Arab world combined. We made incredible progress recently with the Muslim world. The Abraham Accords. Jews and Israelis have been traveling to the United Arab Emirates. Yet a week ago, a rabbi was slaughtered there, murdered there. His crime? Being Jewish. So the violence, the aggression, the oppression is not coming from Israel. Israel is concerned with survival and protecting its civilians, its citizens. Any aggression, unfortunately, is coming from fundamentalists who cannot tolerate Jewish sovereignty on land which they believe should be Muslim.
Completely understood. So, in other words, as quick summary of what we have spoken about so far, I wanted to ask a couple of more questions briefly. But what we have spoken about so far is that there is oppression, but the really oppressed ones are the people of the nation of Israel, like you rightly point out, which is not just the Jews, but also the Arabs of the nation of Israel. And the clear oppressor, it has to be as clear as daylight, black and white. And it's really unfortunate. This message has been lost through proper propaganda of coming from various quarters. Now, let me ask you. So far we spoke about until 1948, oppression, oppressed, and of course you made multiple points about what's happened since then also. But let me ask you this pointed question there, which is: so today's residents of Gaza and West Bank, in relation to Israel's disposition, does Israel want to oppress? Does Israel oppress the residents of Gaza and West Bank? Because that's the, again, storyline that is advanced. What is your take on this?
So I think oppression is a very broad term that can be interpreted in many ways. So Israel enforces security measures to protect its civilians and its citizens. These measures are purely defensive. Israel is not expansionist. It's given away more territory than it's ever captured in defensive wars. But there is a reality on the ground. Because of this conflict, there are hardships that Palestinians, the Arabs, face if they're living under Hamas or the Palestinian Authority. So take October the 7th. On October the 7th, Hamas launched the most brutal slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust. There was always going to be a response to that. And Hamas, who had spent decades fortifying Gaza and turning the entire strip into a military fort with a labyrinth of tunnels larger than the London network, the underground network, they launched this attack knowing that there would be a response. Now, Israel is then faced with the horrendous task, the overwhelming task, the impossible task of trying to engage Hamas, rescue the hostages in a highly populated area where Hamas want to maximize civilian casualties. They didn't put their civilians in their tunnels to protect them from any airstrikes or any bombs against Hamas. They put their civilians above the tunnels. So Hamas are hiding under their civilians, under hospitals like Al-Shifa, under schools. And Israel is now faced with the impossible task of engaging Hamas in a densely populated, highly urban environment. Despite this, so Israel then develops incredible measures to minimize civilian casualties. No other nation, no other campaign, military campaign, has seen anything like this. They start creating maps, warning residents in these areas that there's going to be an incursion because there's a Hamas position here, or the battle needs to fight within these neighborhoods. So how do they do that? They place millions of phone calls, drop millions of flyers. They facilitate 700,000 tons of aid into Gaza so that the Gazan civilians can eat. And you have to bear that the majority of Gazans hate Israelis. They celebrated October the 7th. I've been on Facebook profile after Facebook profile when researching thousands and thousands of Gazans and just watching every single one of them on October the 7th celebrating. It was very rare to find Gazans that didn't celebrate this slaughter of Jews. Despite this, Israel has gone to incredible lengths to minimize the civilian death toll. And we've got to a point now where it's basically a 1-to-1 militant to civilian ratio. Now, the world wants you to believe there's a genocide, but you have to ask yourself, if so, why is it a 1-to-1 death toll? Why is Israel facilitating 700,000 tons of aid if it wants to genocide the people? Why did they just vaccinate basically Israel, help enable the vaccination of the entire civilian population of Gaza against polio just a few weeks ago? This is not the actions of a genocidal nation. Yet, the world wants to paint this as oppression. Now, there is hardships. I would not like to be a Gazan living there today. A child is a child. A 5-year-old girl living in Gaza has the same right to life and has the same worth as a Jewish 5-year-old girl living here in Jerusalem or Israel. They're the same, and neither deserve hardship. But because of the actions of Hamas, the 5-year-old living in Gaza will be living in terrible conditions in comparison to most 5-year-old girls around the world. And the same is true for the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. While life there is people don't understand how good life is there, by the way. I was driving through there the other day, and a £500,000 Maybach with Palestinian registration plates drove past me. Like, every single village has huge villas here. Like, I just wish those people that are marching on the streets of London, talking about the oppression of the Jews in the of the Arabs in the West Bank, could go on the same drives I go on and see the BMW M5s and the Range Rovers and the luxury cars with Palestinian registration plates driving through Bethlehem. Bethlehem's got a lot of rich Arabs living there, Bethlehem in Hebrew. But there are certain restrictions. There is freedom of movement, but it's not as easy to move in from certain areas. So there's only really exiting via the Allenby crossing into Jordan. So there are certain restrictions, but that's because there's a war going on. There's been a decades-long war between the Jews and the Arabs, or the Israelis and the Palestinians in this region. And so it's not that Israel is oppressing at all. Israel puts in place defensive measures to minimize the risk of its citizens being slaughtered, as we witnessed on October the 7th.
Yes, and it's quite legitimate for Israel to want to defend its own people. That's not an illegitimate endeavor. But unfortunately, like you rightly point out, while Israel is trying to defend, the clear complexity of the situation is there is an ongoing war because the other side isn't of a similar mindset. And I'm really glad that Israel has been able to defend itself successfully through God's grace so far, although, of course, many in Israel have suffered and there are still hostages. Now, we want to send our best wishes to you, Joseph. I hope that the Christians who are watching and the non-Christians who are watching would really take this message seriously, that they shouldn't give in to this propaganda that the Jewish state is the oppressor, but rather the Jewish state, unfortunately, isn't just facing a physical aggression against its own existence, but it's also facing a much more vicious propaganda that's happening, which is making the entire dynamic very vicious and hard to maneuver. Well, we want to, as Christians, extend our warm support to you, Joseph, and also to all your loved ones and friends. And we really hope that through God's grace, Israel would be able to not just survive, but also flourish in and through all of these things. Thank you very much for joining with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's incredibly important that the connection and the close friendship between our two communities, the Jewish community and the Christian community, continues for many, many years to come. So thank you for what you're doing, Arul. Thank you for shining a light on this very important issue.
And also for those who are keen on watching some material from Joseph, he has produced some very insightful material. Like he rightly said earlier, he's based in Israel right now, and he has produced some very, very insightful material from Israel about what's happening in Israel, what's happening outside of Israel in what is called the West Bank and Gaza. Please take a look. His YouTube channel, I think you can find by searching for the term Israel Advocacy Movement. the acronym IAM, Israel Advocacy Movement. So I hope that many would continue watching. Thank you very much, Joseph, and hopefully our friendship would survive and friendship would flourish, and hopefully through God's grace we'd be able to turn the tide on the propaganda that's happening.
God willing. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, so that was truth of the matter. We wanted to, of course, clearly get to the bottom of the truth in relation to understanding this marketing propaganda in relation to Nakba, whether the Arabs of Palestine had suffered a catastrophe or not. Now, clearly, in our discussion with Joseph, we have brought out some facts. Joseph has been candid in his explanation in relation to various aspects of what has happened in the history of that land area. And what must be clear to everyone who is sincere, unbiased, and who cares not about religious propaganda, but about the truth, is that the real oppressed ones in this entire situation, in this entire long-term conflict, are really the Jews of the Jewish nation. Now, of course, like you rightly pointed out, there are many Arabs also flourishing in Israel. So I really want to encourage the Christian audience today, as we close this segment, to be willing to extend your helping hand to all your Jewish neighbors who are still perhaps in the Judeo-Christian West, but also, as nations, as Christian nations, that we'd also be really consistently extending a hand of support in every manner that we can towards the nation of Israel. Let us not give in to propaganda. Let us not become part of the propaganda by talking about what is not a genocide and forgetting what is the real intent of genocide. So I hope really that the Christian nations would also play a significant role in supporting Israel. Thank you very much for watching. We'll have a 5 minutes break before moving on to the next segment. Hello, welcome back to this second segment of Light to the World Tuesday. Now, of course, we had just wrapped up a productive conversation with Joseph Cohen on essentially the topic of whether Nakba is a fake news or not. Please have a watch if you haven't seen the full interview, and we'll be producing various, cut versions of these interviews in the future in our channel, both Light of the World and Operation Stephen. If you haven't subscribed to the journalism channel, LOTW, standing for Light of the World, LOTW Press, please subscribe so you can stay on top of the future programs that we'd have. Every Tuesday, 6 p.m. GMT starting, Light of the World Tuesday. Now, coming up, I think have to have a slight switch of segments today because we have an interviewee waiting, and one of our previous segments went on for a little bit longer than expected. So what we're going to do is segment 3 is what we're going to do right now. And we're going to ask the serious question of what should be the role of the church in the society in the UK, in the program Nation Under God. Subsequent to which, I think we'll look at the question of why our nations are so divided today when foundations are shaken. So let's get to Nation Under God. We who live in the West, in the Judeo-Christian West, sometimes because of what has happened in the last few decades, might even not remember the idea that we are supposed to be a Christian nation. The UK, the US, and various other nations are meant to be Christian nations. We're supposed to be nations under God. Of course, I am based in the UK, and so I can speak on behalf of the UK right now. What is the role of the church in the society in the UK? For those who are familiar with the dynamics of the church in the UK, Church of England was supposed to occupy a formal role. But essentially, under what has been happening in terms of the propaganda in the last few decades, the Church of England is almost capitulating, giving into ideas which are not of God. Instead of being a very clear voice, hearing from God or understanding God and speaking into the lives of the nation, what the Church of England has done so far, unfortunately, has not just not done that, but also given into non-Christian propaganda and began affirming that. But that doesn't stop us Christians from at least turning a corner. And that is where today in this particular segment, I really want to ask the question, do Christians really have a role in the society? Of course, as Christians, we preach the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. We talk about sin. We talk about the need for people to repent. And we talk about the need for people to become Christians, with the eternity in mind. Is that all to what Christians are supposed to do in a nation such as ours? Or do Christians have a much wider role, more responsibilities on top of merely preaching the gospel in relation to setting an agenda for our nation? And so to discuss this particular topic, I have another precious friend who is a longtime friend. Many might be familiar with him already. I am going to discuss this with none other than Jason Burns, a missionary, a British missionary who is currently based in Ghana in Africa, who is planning his future. I think he is working on setting up a mission in another nation, which I leave unnamed, for him to perhaps let let everyone know at the time of his choosing. But he is based in Africa and he has a vision for Africa. But he's really a British missionary, and he has a heart for our nation back here. And so, not just that, he is the founder of this missionary organization called Africa Without Borders. So, Jason Burns, it's lovely to have you here today.
Thank you, Arul. It's good to be with you too, brother. It's good to
Lovely.
be with you.
Absolutely. It's good to see you smiling in front of you in this formal setting. To meet you in our inaugural episode gives me great pleasure, Jason. Now, of course, we know the topic for today, and I want to begin by asking you the question, as Christians in a Christian nation such as the UK, what is the role of Christians or the church in general in our society? Are we merely only preaching the gospel, which clearly has to be done, which clearly is of eternal value, and therefore we really have to invest time and effort in doing that? But my question really is that the only thing that we have to be doing, or should we take a greater responsibility in terms of setting the agenda for our nation? Please let us know your thoughts at the outset.
Well, I have five ways of coming at this from Jesus' perspective, the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul, St. Augustine, the church in the time of communism, and the church in the time of the Byzantine Empire when the Muslims took over. So those are 5 areas that can inform us how to deal with the situation in the UK. If you look at the Lord Jesus Christ, he was first of all interested in the kingdom of God. He said there's a difference between the state, render unto Caesar what's Caesar's. So there's a danger. We have to speak out to politics, but there's a danger that if you look at the history of Catholicism, it got wrapped up in politics. So we've got to maintain what the church's foundations are. And if you look at the history of Britain, the church, the reason why we're in the mess is because the church has lost its foundation. It lost its discipleship mandate, its holiness mandate. It gave education over to the secularists. So the church has to maintain its foundation. And Jesus would encourage mission. He would encourage loving your enemies. He would encourage humility, servanthood, but he never shied away from dealing with authority. In John chapter 2, verse 13 and 16, he goes into the temple and he turns the temple over. So there is a mandate for the church and its leaders to speak out against tyranny and oppression. So that's just some things from Jesus' life. I don't know if you want to pick up on anything there from Jesus' life. So I think Jesus, if he was here today, he would focus on the kingdom, discipleship, mission, holiness, but he loving your enemies, loving the oppressed, but he would also not shy away from confronting evil in society. So it's not wrong for a pastor to speak out against oppression. In the time of the Nazis, one of the faults with the pastors is they wouldn't speak out against the Nazis. They wouldn't speak out against the Jewish people being taken away. And so Hitler was able to infiltrate the church. But the reason why he was able to infiltrate the church is because Bonhoeffer wrote a book called Discipleship, and the German people didn't listen to it. And so the German people weren't being disciples of Christ. Hitler was able to infiltrate the church. The pastors kept quiet, but the pastors should have spoke out, and the Christians should have been stronger as Christians. So that's just some thoughts from Jesus and a historical example in Bonhoeffer.
Lovely.
I don't know if that helps.
I know. I really think the way you began is very important, with the warning that, of course, we are still the church. We're not a political organization, which clearly Roman Catholicism didn't understand and therefore got wrong. Not just there, but in all sorts of other areas, they got the mandate wrong. But your point, overwhelming point, is that while we are careful that we are still the church and our foundations are clearly as Christians as the church, we still have a responsibility, like what the Lord Jesus Christ himself showed by example, to speak into the lives of the nation. I'm really glad that you picked on this example of what happened in Germany, the need for a greater number, of course, we can't correct history right now, but hopefully at least we can learn from history and therefore won't let history repeat itself in relation to the future. So that's really lovely. So in other words, your message for Christians who are watching, who are wondering what should I do in terms of politics or any of these things, is really that we do have, as Christians, we do have a responsibility to play, especially in speaking about morality, I would think. So if I could ask you, Jason, if you have a few broad points that you would have liked the church to have already been speaking loud and clear in, let's say, the UK, maybe we'll just set the context as the UK. Where do you think the church should have already spoken, maybe in the last decade, last couple of decades, and where have they been silent? And what should we do today?
Well, I think the Bible says judgment begins at the house of God. And I think during the Enlightenment, rationalism came in, biblical criticism came in the 18th and 19th century, evolution came in, and that was the beginning of the major erosion in UK society. And then since then, we also gave up education. We handed it over to the secularists. The Church of England handed their education over to the secularists, the independent evangelicals, and gave education. And so we allowed the secularists to educate our children. So one of the things that the church needs to do is take back education. I know there are churches, there are Christian schools, but there needs to be Christian universities more in UK, and also more Christian schools, because the youth and the generation after generation are being indoctrinated with the secularist agenda. So the church needs to retake the education realm rapidly. What the secularists have done, they say, oh, you can be chaplains, you can have a Christian union, just give us a little bit. But no, the church used to educate. There was not only a church, but they would have a school, they would have a college, and that's gone, and that needs to come back rapidly. There needs to be a reformation within the church. The church, many of the theological colleges have become liberal. There needs to be a return back to orthodoxy. The pastors need to be preaching the gospel. They've allowed wokeism and LGBT and these things to come in the church. And if there isn't a reformation within the church, people have to come out of the Church of England. They have to come out of the Baptist, the Methodist. You're only prolonging the decline of society if you will not stand up in your denomination. If you will not make a stand in your denomination, you must come out and start planting new churches. And thirdly, there has to be a massive mission going on where churches are coordinating, working together more than we've ever done. The Muslims are rapidly taking over the country with mission. If you look at them, Dawah teams, they're making every opportunity. We are asleep as a church. I know there are people like you and others doing mission work, but it's nothing compared to what it should be. We have to be going back to some basic things that we've always known, such as a dependence on the Holy Spirit. There needs to be a revival. It doesn't matter how much if the Titanic's going down, you can move the deck chairs as much as you want, but the Titanic's going down, and we can do politics, we can do everything, but that's just moving the deck chair. The fundamental problem is there's a malaise within the church. The church is dying spiritually. There's a judgment on the church. The church has to repent. It has to come alive spiritually. The next thing that needs to be done is we need people like John Knox. We need people who are bold, who are willing to stand up against abortion, LGBT. People have been too quiet. People have kept quiet about LGBT over the years. They've kept quiet against abortion. Name me 5 solid evangelical leaders over the last 5 years that have spoken out against LGBT, whatever it is today. Wokeism, transgender. Name me 5 great evangelical leaders. You won't find any because they're afraid to go on TV. So we need people who are bold and are willing to, like Elon Musk is not a Christian. If you noticed in America, the people who are speaking out against LGBT, the people who are speaking out against transgender, is people like Elon Musk, is people like Daily Wire. Many of them are not Orthodox Christians, but they're speaking out. They're more bolder than the pastors of the UK. They're more bolder than the Christians of UK. So there has to be a boldness, a willing to step out, and then finally, there has to be a willing to suffer. This is a fight, it's a battle, and you might be cancelled, you might have your bank balance taken away, you might be a pastor in the Church of England, lose your manse. It doesn't matter. There has to be a willingness now to suffer. If they're going to go and pray outside an abortion clinic, if they're going to arrest you, so what? You got to be willing to push the boundary and suffer. And frankly, many Christians, pastors, and churches, they're not willing to suffer. They're not willing to rock the boat. And the world will let you be a Christian so long as you don't rock the boat. The Church of England, the main denominations, they'll let you be a Christian so long as you don't rock the boat. But as soon as you speak out, they will counsel you. They will do everything they can to destroy you. So you've got to be willing. It's a time not to be quiet. It's a time to be bold, and it's a time to be willing to suffer.
So that's a very clear message to all Christians who are watching from Jason Burns. Of course, he has been a missionary for a very long time. I still have more questions to ask Jason, but just to make sure I sort of reinforce the point you're making, the church needs to understand who we truly are. We need to speak about morality when there is moral decay. It's not just that we can't give in to propaganda, anti-Christian propaganda, but it is also that we can't be silent even. We need to speak out, and our voice should be clear. And you picked up on a few topics there, Jason. Of course, the LGBTQ or whatever, LGBT, who knows, the inventions that go on in this field is phenomenal. So, no wonder we get these things wrong. Like you rightly said, abortion, in relation to abortion, like you also rightly said, and going back maybe a couple of more steps, even regular education. It's a real shame that Christians have allowed non-Christian entities to take lead in this. May I please maybe ask you this way? Do you think the church has misunderstood, the popular saying or the popular idea that the church must be separated from the state, which I'm assuming we'd all agree on. The church is in the state is in the church, but that does not mean we haven't got a political role to play. That does not mean we haven't got a message to give to the nation, which may come across political also. Would you maybe summarize like that? What's your take on that?
Yeah, Christ is Lord, not only of the church, but he's Lord of creation, and he's Lord of the political realm, the scientific realm, the philosophical realm. So everything has to come under the lordship of Christ. So that means the church does have a responsibility to challenge and guide society, whether it be in science, philosophy, whether it be in politics, whether it be in education. So we shouldn't take this idea that because the state is secular, that we should mind our own business. No, the secular dances to Christ. The secular has to dance to the lordship of Christ. So if you're an artist, if you're a philosopher, if you're a politician, you shouldn't be, if you're a teacher, you shouldn't be ashamed to bring the lordship of Christ into that domain and shine light from the Christian worldview into every aspect of society. The Muslims do it. They don't get any comeback from it. We're the ones who hold to Jesus Christ, who says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. So we've been pushed back and kept silent, and it's not good enough. We have to be willing to be bold. And like I said, if you're a songwriter, if you're an artist, if you're a philosopher, if you're a pastor, whatever it is, what God has given you to do, whether you're working in a rubbish dump, whether you're a nurse, health educator, hospital, you shouldn't be ashamed to bring the lordship of Christ into the medical profession, into the political sphere, into philosophy, into education. And, if you're a nurse today, you're not allowed to say anything of your Christian faith. This is nonsense. The Muslims are allowed to do it. The LGBT, if you go and drive in any town in UK, you'll see flags on hospitals for LGBT, but yet you're a Christian nurse and you can't speak your faith. So we have to push back and be willing to suffer and be bold. There'll become a day where nurses and teachers and journalists will be put in prison. But in the end, they can't keep the truth down. In the end, we'll win. In the end, people will wake up and begin to see the need to find Christ if we're willing to suffer. But we have to push back and put the Lordship of Christ in every aspect of society.
I completely understand, and I'm reminded of the verse that Paul writes in relation to bringing to captive anything that is against Christ, every ideology, every viewpoint. I was going to ask you this question, but I think you have touched on a few areas here already, Jason. I was going to ask you for some particular advice. You have spoken loud and clear that the church has been docile, and I was going to ask for particular advice on what should we be doing. Like you rightly said, you want to see 5 great leaders. Of course, we want many more great leaders. I think your challenge was name 5 great leaders. Now, clearly, I can't name, which is a bit of a shame. And we can take the responsibility. We can make mistakes, but at least for the future, we can change things. We need leaders raise up to send the message of Jesus Christ in every area of life. Secular doesn't mean we can't speak. Secular only means we are not taking both roles at the same time as being state and the church, but we are legitimate contributors in what is meant to be a Christian nation. And therefore we need to speak in. You spoke about the fact of, bravely speaking out, not being afraid of persecution. You spoke of the fact that churches coming together and, raising our voice. Do you have any other particular advice that you want to flag up right now, Jason? What can we do, maybe pragmatically, in relation to beginning to becoming these clear voices representing Jesus in our nation?
I think that know your enemy. Educate yourself on your enemy. Islam's coming down the road. The next 10, 20, 30 years, Islam will be dominating UK society. You should know Islam. You should study Islam, and you should get ready to be able to answer and do apologetics to Muslims and counter that threat coming down the line. Wokeism, you need to read up on that and study it. Educate your children, educate your community, your church community, how to deal with that. So know your enemy. Secondly, community. One of the reasons why the Islam is growing and the culture growing is people feel isolated in this TikTok age. So we need to build community, Bible study, small group fellowships, new church planting. This is important because when you go to church very often, you have a cup of tea, people go home, nobody speaks to each other, you're never invited to somebody's house. But the reason why the Roman Empire fell is because it was said that Christians love each other, they care for each other. So we have a golden opportunity to be doing food banks, to not just doing social action, but genuine loving community in a local church, having fellowship together. The time of the revival of John Wesley and Whitefield, it stopped the French Revolution because of that revival. But one of the things of that revival is the Methodists had the love feast. They would have communion and they would have fellowship together, and it was said that they loved each other. So we have to create communities that really love each other, churches that really care for each other, invite people for have meals in church. This is really important, and invite the community, because the community people are isolated today. Elderly people, young people, they feel isolated, and the Muslims pick up on that, the cults pick up on that, and they love bomb them and draw them into their fold. I think thirdly, there has to be, again, not reckless leadership where people want to be the hero of the hour. There's a difference between someone who wants to be the hero of the hour and being reckless, but someone in humility and love and a love for the truth is willing to say enough is enough. And that begins in wherever God's put you. So in the media, this is saying enough is enough. You're bringing the truth. So wherever God has put you, you've got to be willing to put your foot down in humility and say enough is enough. One last thing as well, the way to undermine churches that have gone liberal is to start small groups. In the time of the Pietist revival in Germany, the Pietists Frank and Spencer, they started homes for orphans, but they undermined the Lutheran churches that had died by starting small Bible study groups. So I'd encourage you to start little small prayer meetings, Bible study groups in the Church of England, in the Baptist, in the Methodist. Like, go under the radar and take over these denominations by these little prayer groups. And also to do that when the state gets more controlling and becomes more tyrannical, these small groups are going to be absolutely important, because they're going to clamp down on the churches. They're going to close down church buildings and say, oh, you don't come up to our LGBT standards or whatever. So these small prayer groups and study groups will be central to keeping the faith growing and strong in years to come when persecution comes to the UK. And it's coming.
And it's coming. Well, absolutely. So lovely 4 points. So if I could reiterate. So your first one was that know your enemy. Christians clearly need to learn about what's happening in relation to our nation, study other religions, find out why they are doing what they're doing. Secondly, your point was about building communities. Christians will be Christians only if we have genuine love for each other and we are able to care for each other and also extend that care and concern to even non-Christians. So we need to do that. If anyone is watching, please take Jason's comment there carefully and seriously. Everyone need to take responsibility. And the third point, of course, also applies to every individual, which is that wherever you are, begin to speak out. Begin to speak out. And finally, of course, focus on coming together to read the word of the Lord, study the word of the Lord, even in denominations which might appear to be crumbling down the weight of anti-Christian propaganda. So as Christians, we have a serious role to play. Now, finally, Jason, before I let you go, I know you have written a number of books. I was surprised to actually find, I didn't know about this before. You have a number of books, a few hundred pages each, number of books on various political entities. And so clearly you've been studying, you've been practicing what you've just preached to us in your life. Please give us a brief introduction, just 1 minute of how people can get hold of your books, where to find and that sort of stuff.
Well, if you Google Amazon, Tommy Robinson and the Coming Civil War on Amazon, that's a book that the thesis of the book is saying if you take away Tommy Robinson's free speech, civil war will come. Without free speech, without the ability for people to share, people will become radicalized. So that's the thesis of the book. Actually, The Guardian actually wrote a review on it, and they were saying it was calling for civil war, and it wasn't. It's nothing to do with calling civil war. It's saying if you continue to persecute people and take away people's free speech, then it will cause civil war because people can't communicate their ideas. So that's one. And then there's a number of books on President Donald Trump. One of them is a bestseller. It seems to be selling a lot, called Save America. And it's just a pet topic. I've been praying a lot for President Donald Trump, that he get converted and stand up for the Christian faith. There's one on Nigel Farage, and there's one on Tucker Carlson, and there's other books as well. But just type in Jason Burns, Trump, Jason Burns, Nigel Farage, Jason Burns, Tommy Robinson, or Jason Burns, any topic, and something might come up, whether Islam or Christianity, it should come up.
Lovely, Jason. Of course, I'm pretty sure, even though I got to know only recently, I'm pretty sure knowing you personally and knowing other aspects of your ministry, I'm pretty sure it'll be very useful to get one's hands on some of these books and read Jason's thought on that. Thank you for sharing your views on what comes from clearly your experience in ministry, both in the UK and acting as an international missionary, British missionary in Africa right now. Thank you for sharing your precious thoughts on the fact that Christians ought to be vocal and be speaking about all sorts of different issues. And I'm really glad you have written a book on Tommy Robinson. Every time I think about that man, even though I haven't spoken much about him in public, every time I think about that man, I'm almost moved to tears. And so far, I haven't really openly supported him, mainly because, I haven't really set the platform properly to be able to do that. But clearly, a person who has been persecuted merely for trying to speak out on a legitimate issue. And that is a cause of concern. Now, before we part ways, Jason, any final thoughts before we say goodbye? How are things happening in Africa? Well, what's the latest there?
We're just praying for guidance. We need to get Dorcas to visit UK, and then we'll go to Malawi. But how we do that, the finances and things, we have to wait on God. But just to say that what you're doing, this is very, very much needed. Christian media like this, I think you're going to do really well. I really enjoyed listening to you and the Jewish man. The advocacy was superb, and I think this is going to go from strength to strength, brother. So I hope others follow suit and follow what you're doing, because it's really good, brother.
And for those who, thank you very much, Jason, for the remarks. But for those who want to follow Jason's works, he has a YouTube channel, Africa Without Borders. You can subscribe to that. He is a missionary who is dependent on financial contribution from others. If you're a Christian and if you're looking for a Christian mission work that you want to support, I'd like to personally recommend Jason as a friend who I've known for a long time, through thick and thin. And so I'd really like to commend his work to you. And Jason, thank you very much for all the wonderful work you've done for the Lord so far. And I really wish, through God's grace, that things would go really well in your future endeavor also, including, Dorcas being able to be here in the UK. We know the challenges involved, but Godspeed in all of that. God's blessings to you, Jason. Thank you very much.
Thank you. God bless you. God bless you. Bye.
So, should Christians or the church in general play an active role in society? We've heard it loud and clear from someone who is a veteran in Christian leadership, in Christian ministry, someone who has been interacting with non-Christians as a society and so on for such a long period of time. Christians clearly have a greater role to play. Apart from preaching the gospel is vital. No doubt about that. Everyone should be clearly making sure that their church, someone somewhere, or they themselves are preaching the gospel if they're not doing some other work for the Lord. But while that is not neglected, we also need to speak into the lives of our nations. Clearly in the UK, it has to happen. It hasn't been happening for a very long time, and it has to start. It has to happen. Even if the forces that are out there would prevent us from speaking out by canceling us or whatnot, persecuting us, putting us in prison and whatever, we need to be willing to push back, to advance the agenda of our precious Lord Jesus Christ, and hopefully get the legal structure of our nations under subjection to our precious Lord Jesus Christ. Now, thank you for staying with us on this particular interview. We were supposed to have 2 more segments, but in the interest of time, I think we'll do 1 more segment, which will begin after a short break. Thank you very much. Hello, welcome back. Now, we had a couple of different interviews just gone and had a very productive time. Speaking initially to a Jewish thought leader, Jewish journalist, and subsequently we also heard from a Christian missionary in relation to the church and the UK and the role of the church in the society in the UK. Coming up now is one last segment. Apologies about the order in which things are showing up here, but we only have one last segment that I'm going to present to you in the interest of time, because we have been delayed in a couple of different ways so far. And that is in asking the question, why are our nations, and by our nations, I mean the Judeo-Christian Western nations, why are our nations so divided now when foundations are shaken? The fact that the Western nations are very divided is palpable on a daily basis. There are so many issues that we have to grapple with on a daily basis, where people actually take polar opposite views. The presence of social media hasn't helped in having a little bit of quiet or calm. But that's all right, because it's only bringing out what is already there without social media as fundamental differences in our society. What I want to do right now over the next maybe 15-20 minutes or so is to unpack really what is happening in our nations. You might have heard of terms such as wokeism or virtue signaling and that sort of stuff. Now, I want to present in my own view what really is happening in our nations. Is it true that our nations are actually deeply divided? Or is it merely something that we are hearing about, but in reality, our nations perhaps aren't deeply divided? It's perhaps the kind of reasoning I really want to do. Now, let's, for example, take a few issues on which our nations seem to be, in a palpable manner, taking polar opposite views. For instance, LGBTQ. This idea of gender identity and the need to have pride on some sort of a gender identity model is taken up by Western governments as a project that they want to advance with public money. But in reality, is the nation really for it? Or in the nation, do we have a wide disagreement on this particular topic? Not just LGBTQ related ideas. You can also mention, of course, abortion. You can mention other issues, such as what we discussed in our first segment in relation to whether there is a genocide happening in Israel, and various other similar issues where people seem to be taking polar opposite views. What is really going on in our nations? Let me put it this way. I think in summary, what I can say is that what has been happening is that what was traditionally understood to be immorality or a lie in the last couple of decades, in the last few decades, a portion of this, or perhaps all of it, are beginning to be called as respectively morality or truth. In other words, there is a redefinition of what is truth and a redefinition of what is morality. And as the redefinitions are happening, it would appear that anyone who doesn't agree with the new redefinitions happening, the newer definitions, anyone who doesn't agree with that seems to be called some sort of a person who is deeply immoral, who is not worthy to even exist, and who has to be cancelled at any cost because such a person doesn't belong in society. Now, this is happening despite the fact that it would appear that perhaps a silent majority in the nations that we have in mind, the UK, the US, and so on, perhaps the silent majority aren't on the same page with the redefinitions, the new definitions. But because there is the propaganda that is going on, that unless you follow our line and agree that the new definitions are the only valid definitions, we will silence you, we will cancel you, because that propaganda, with the help of the state and various tools from the state and other institutions is happening, the silent majority are remaining silent. But it would appear if there was a vote, a referendum in relation to all of the issues that I mentioned earlier, it is likely that just like how it showed up for Brexit, it is likely in relation to every one of these areas, the silent majority might side with what was the historical definition on various of these issues. So that's my thesis, and I'll demonstrate what I'm speaking about by taking a simple example. What has happened in relation to sexual morality? Now, of course, there has been a time, until a few decades ago, where everyone agreed, as a society, that sex has to be had within the confines of marriage. Now, the new definition wants to move the line. So previously, any sex outside of marriage was seen as abominable, including trying to express your sexual desires or feelings out in public. Some sort of sexual perversion that you see in our streets today during Pride festivals would have been clearly categorized as immoral, whether there is a new idea of gender identity or not. If you expose yourself in some manner, shape, or form, that would have been seen as immoral in the times gone. But today, the redefinition has moved the line, or at least is attempting to move the line in the mindset of the general population. And what is the redefinition that they need? Sex is not just something that you can have within marriage. It is also something that you can have outside of marriage, as long as the entities involved are happy with it. And of course, there are ramifications because of the change, the moving of the goalpost, the moving of the line. The ramifications are in relation to sexual activity. Because there is a redefinition, now children have to be brainwashed, and therefore what was clearly seen as immoral acts in the time past now have to be officially advanced as propaganda material. So you see pride festivals, you see all sorts of LGBTQ story times and this and whatnot out in schools, going out to children and out in the streets for public consumption, whether you like it or not. And so what has happened is sexual perversion is being normalized. Note carefully, even before we go on to, exploring this idea of gender identity, more fundamentally, what is happening is sexual perversion and the demonstration of sexual perversion in public sphere is being normalized. That is happening more fundamentally. If you study the history of LGBTQ movement, you'd find out some reprehensible characters involved who come across as scientists or researchers, but who are clearly, for anyone who is sensible, who wants to explore this field in an unbiased manner, if they read the history of these reprehensible characters, you would clearly get the idea that, hey, look, these guys are clearly sexual perverts. They wanted to have sexual orgies and they call that research. If that were to happen without the name tag scientist anywhere else, will be able to call it out in a clear manner. But even when so-called researchers or scientists do that, the general public would be able to read beyond what they are presented as a veneer and would be able to say, look, this is sexual perversion. And so the point very simply is, the fact of sexual perversion being normalized is what has happened over the last few decades. And as that was happening, because that can't be spoken out in public or presented in public as the real motivation, essentially saying, hey, we don't care about God, we don't care about his morality. What we can redefine morality in our own way. Who is God to tell us what morality is? Instead of presenting it like that, they want to now move on to propaganda, which they have already gone to by saying that, hey, you are against the LGBTQ minority. You are against those who are oppressed. You are against. And so the point is, we have skipped a few steps and gone straight to hearing propaganda from the government or governments across the world. But in reality, I genuinely think, from my day-to-day experience with my anecdotal, my interactions with various people across various walks of life, perhaps clearly there is a portion of taking in of this propaganda, but there is a wide populace which doesn't give in to this nonsense, hasn't given into this nonsense yet. And they would know, despite the propaganda coming from various quarters, what is intrinsically, based on a testimony from their own conscience, intrinsically what is God's morality and what isn't, especially in a nation which has been informed by Christian morals for such a long time. This is not true just with LGBTQ related sexual perversion. It is also true in relation to, let's talk about abortion. Now, today you hear the propaganda of, the right for women to choose what they need to do with their own bodies. But carefully, if you note what is happening more fundamentally, what is really happening is, we want to allow for sexual relationships outside of marriages to be taken for granted, to be propagating, across the population. And therefore, when you talk about abortion, of course, there could be a few minority of cases where situation could involve such as rape and other things. If I keep that aside for a moment and focus on the larger context, the larger situation at play, my point really is, if you stick to the sanctity of the morality of sex within marriage, this topic of abortion likely wouldn't even show up in a society, because within the confines of a family, people would want to have children and nurture children in the way they deem appropriate, even if they are not Christians, but certainly in a nation which is informed by Christian values. This is what is bound to happen. So in other words, there is a deeper problem. An immoral act is now being declared as morality, but the powers in play don't want to talk about that openly, but they want to go a number of steps ahead and deal with propaganda. before people can investigate what is really happening behind the hood, they want to call them out as bigots and ask for them to be cancelled and all of similar ramifications. So here is where Christians have an important role to play. We know what morality is. We know it because the Lord Jesus Christ has taught it to us. And in the interview that I had with Joseph Cohen, a friend from Israel, we also brought out the idea that even pre-Christian times, from the Hebrew scriptures, you get the same principles that come out. So both the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, which the Jews hold dear, non-Christian Jews hold dear today, and the New Testament, which our precious Lord Jesus Christ has given, we get a consistent view on what morality is. Christians have the responsibility to take ownership for this and to take the message to the world, to our nations, to what are meant to be Christian nations, and declare the definitions of morality loud and clear. Whether it is in relation to LGBTQ agenda, or it is in relation to politics, how we have a particular value system which contradicts with the value system of, let's say, Islam, like the way Tommy Robinson spoke about and wants to continue to speak about. Like the way we have to be speaking about immigration, not just immigration, but also the problems of Islam in our nation, even without immigration. All of these problems have to be spoken about openly. And Christians have to take responsibility to bring the message out in the open and to declare it loud and clear, so our nations could have a Christian DNA, for everyone to be able to see how Christians as a community could operate in a godly manner, for others to follow suit. This is what is supposed to happen, but this is not just not happening, but what is also happening is that the entire opposite, where the anti-Christian forces have taken charge and are shaking the foundations of our nation. It is time for us to wake up as Christians. We have to speak up loud and clear, so our nation would know what it means to be Christian. Thank you very much for patiently watching today's inaugural edition of Light of the World Tuesday. Until next Tuesday, goodbye from me. God's blessings.